Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Worley, the pastor of Arcadia First United Methodist Church in Arcadia, Louisiana. And it's a joy to greet you on this fine day as we continue looking at our Bible study, which is based on this adult study that two of our adult classes are using at the church. And during the month of May, the topic has been geared toward grace and what that means for us as individuals and biblically how we theologically interpret grace. As many of you are aware who've watched these videos, you know that my wife, Susan Meister, usually leads these, is heavily involved in the ministry of study at the church. She had surgery this week, is doing fine, but felt it best if she didn't participate this week. We're planning on next week her being with us. And so today we're going to look at the story of Jesus' crucifixion based on Luke's account of that. And it's that part of the crucifixion where Jesus has been hoisted up on the cross and is dying from the effects of the crucifixion. And if you remember the story, there's a thief on each side. That's the term that's used. One on his right and one on his left. And one of them is giving Jesus a lot of flack about the predicament that all three of them find themselves in. He chides him, I guess would be a good word. If you can save others, you can't save himself, and that type of attack on his being. But the other thief is more aware of the reality of the situation, because he tells him to pipe down. He says, we deserve what we're getting. We really are horrible, horrible people, have done despicable things, but this man has done nothing. And then he asks Jesus a very interesting request. He says, Jesus, he calls him by name, and he says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He didn't call him rabbi. He didn't call him teacher, but he calls him by his first name, the name that his mother had given him when he was born. Jesus, remember me. And Jesus grants the request. In modern thought would be, well, that was kind of like a deathbed plea for forgiveness, a deathbed request for salvation. And Jesus grants him that request, offers him grace at that very moment, that very instant in life. And it's an interesting story, but the question that I always look at when I look at that story is, how does that pertain to me? How does that pertain to individuals on an individual basis? This offering grace and accepting grace. I think that most of us would admit that offering grace to someone is hard. It's a difficult thing to do. If we feel that someone has wronged us, it's difficult to when they come to you and say, I'm sorry, would you forgive me? Would you offer me grace? It's sometimes very difficult to say, yes, I forgive you. I offer that grace. And sometimes there have been stories that we'll see, or maybe we've experienced ourselves, when someone offers grace for something that's horrific that's happened to their family. And we say, how can they do that? An example, in 2006, there was this gunman who broke into a school, an Amish school in Pennsylvania, and murdered a whole slew of schoolgirls. that evening, the parents of those girls forgave that gunman. And I remember thinking at that time, God, how did they do that? Would I have the capacity to offer grace to someone, to forgive someone that had just murdered a lot of children in my community? I've seen stories, news stories of convicted murderers in courtrooms where the families of the victims have come forward and sought reconciliation with the convicted murderer. That's got to be hard to do, and yet that's the example that Jesus sets for us to follow through on the cross. He says to the man who's been crucified for crimes against the state, for being a treason against the Roman government, yes, you're forgiven. Please come with me into my kingdom, into my paradise. And so, how do we deal with that? Are we open to forgiving someone that has hurt us, that has harmed us in some way? To open to someone who's offended us, who's broken a promise that they made, and for whatever reason we have been able to keep it? Are we open to doing that? Do we offer grace, or do we hold grudges? And the interesting thing about all this is we'll pray the Lord's Prayer and ask that God forgive us as we forgive others, and yet how often are we holding grudges? And how does that fit into our lives as Christians? Well, it's interesting because Paul, in his second letter to the church in Corinth, in the 5th verse, beginning with the 17th verse, says this: "So if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God has reconciled the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, or entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. So we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. We entreat you," Paul is saying to the church in Corinth and to us, "we entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God." We are called by God to be in the ministry of reconciliation, to not hold grudges, to not seek revenge, to not send out nasty tweets or inflammatory things in emails or on Facebook posts. We are to offer grace to people who offend us, who hurt us, and we are to accept that grace when someone seeks that from us. We are to do that. That's part of being a complete disciple of Jesus. To be a total follower is to reconcile, be made whole through the power of Jesus Christ. You see, offering grace is not for an eternal reward. We may get that, but the reason we do that is it so that we can offer grace to others and live out the example as new creatures in Christ on a daily basis. And that, in a sense, is just a synopsis of what this chapter, this week's study is about. It's being able to fulfill the call that God has given us to reconcile others so that they too can see the love of God in us and offer that love of God to others. So I hope as you look at that story from Luke's gospel and reread the section about Jesus and his interaction with this thief on the cross, that you take it into yourself and begin to absorb how you can be changed because of God's love for you. Now, next week, we're going to wrap up this series on grace that comes out of this book. We're going to be looking at Acts 2, and it's about gaining the gift in order to be able to offer grace. We don't need to do it by ourselves. God empowers us through something that's pretty special, and we're going to talk about that next week. We'll see you then.